Shall we get started?
Sounds good. Thanks, Ken.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Montana Transportation Wildlife Partnership webinar on our Wildlife and Transportation Planning Tool. My name is Ken McDonald. I'm the Chief of the Wildlife Division with Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and also a member of the steering committee of the Montana Wildlife Transportation Partnership, which I'm going to describe in a little bit here. So again, today's webinar is focused on describing the Wildlife Transportation Planning Tool, which is an interactive mapping tool to aid in planning of wildlife accommodation projects around areas of the greatest needs in Montana. A little bit about the webinar. We didn't do any kind of registration, so we're asking everybody, if you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a symbol that says QA. If you will, sometime during the webinar, go in there and enter your name, your affiliation if you have one, and an email address, and that will give us a record of the attendance of the webinar and also allow us to contact you if there's follow-up things. And then also throughout the webinar, if you have a question, go to that Q&A symbol and type your question in, and then we'll have staff that are pulling out the questions, and at the different times of the webinar we'll present those questions to whichever presenter is the most appropriate, and we'll try and answer the questions. So that's the logistics. We're scheduled to be here until 6, so that should give us plenty of time to get through the presentations and the questions. So a little bit of background about how we got here. In December of 2018, the governor's office, in conjunction with the Montana Department of Transportation, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, the Western Transportation Institute, and a coalition of non-government organizations and citizen advocates called Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage, jointly hosted the first ever Montana Wildlife and Transportation Summit. That summit was convened to bring stakeholders together to strengthen working relationships, share information, and to develop strategies to plan and implement wildlife accommodations associated with transportation systems, as well as reduce animal vehicle collisions and protect wildlife and their movement across state highways. An outcome of that summit was an MOU signed by the Department of Transportation and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to help ensure that the agencies continue working together on wildlife and transportation issues, even though some of our staff may change. Another outcome following this summit was an agreement by the Department of Transportation, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage to work together to recommendations that came out of the summit. This has resulted in the three entities forming the collaborative Montana Wildlife and Transportation Partnership. There was strong interest in follow-up to that summit, and people wanting to see action versus just talking about it. So today's webinar is part of that action. So the partnership consists of a steering committee comprised of 2 representatives each from MDT, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and the Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage. We also have a planning and implementation crew or team known as the PIT crew that does a lot of the behind the scenes work directed by the steering committee. And then a data and information work group comprised of research, data management, and GIS specialists that help develop the tool that we're going to be talking about this afternoon. A recommendation from the summit and the partnership was to bring public and private partnerships together to propose and develop wildlife accommodation projects that support wildlife connectivity. We're going to have a specific webinar on that process Thursday, the 27th at 4 o'clock. So today's, again, is talking about this planning tool. And then Thursday, we'll talk about project proposals, which I'll touch on in a second. And working on all of this, we agreed it would be helpful to develop a tool that combines a number of wildlife and transportation variables such as wildlife collision data, wildlife carcass data, and wildlife habitat data that can be used in planning wildlife accommodation projects. We've asked our data and information work group to assemble that tool. They did so and have developed a great product that is built on various data sources that have been compiled, weighted, and ranked, and represent 5 key criteria for identifying areas of need across the state. And the main function of this webinar is to describe that tool and how it works. So the rest of the webinar will be focused on describing and demonstrating the wildlife transportation planning tool. We'll have our experts explain its intended uses, how data were selected, and how the tool was developed, and how to best use the tool, including a demonstration of it. And then again, as I said, on Thursday, we'll have another webinar where we'll talk about the project program, which is the framework that brings public-private partnerships together. And through the program, groups can propose and develop wildlife accommodation projects that support wildlife connectivity. And that webinar, again on Thursday, will include guidance on developing applications for wildlife accommodation projects, how those applications will be evaluated, the selection process, and necessary steps for moving forward. So we expect there'll be some questions about those kinds of things, and we'd ask you to save those for the Thursday webinar and focus your questions today on the planning tool. So today's presentation and planning tool we have 3 presenters, so they'll be presenting different aspects of this. The first presenter is going to be Kylie Paul, who's on the Partnership Steering Committee as one of the Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage representatives, and also works for the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. We also have Adam Messer, who's on our data and information work group that developed the planning tool. He's one of our GIS specialists that works for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. And we have Brian Anderson on the data and information work group that developed the planning tool and works for Montana Department of Transportation. Also on this webinar, we have 2 of our technical folks. We have Justin Goody, who's our research chief with Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, and Deb Wambach, who works for Montana Department of Transportation. They will be assembling the questions that you guys submit through the question and answer function on the Zoom here, and then presenting those questions to the presenters. So on this webinar, there's nobody from the public that's going to be speaking. So if you have a question, you need to write it in that question and answer function of Zoom. And then again, we'll have questions following the section that Kylie and Adam are going to do. And then we'll do questions at the end after Brian has walked us through the demonstration tool itself. So that's a quick introduction. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kylie, who will start us off on information on the planning tool. Kylie, it's all yours.
All right, thanks, Ken. Hey, everyone, my name's Kylie Paul. I work for the Center for Large Landscape Conservation. I'm on the Montana Wildlife and Transportation Partnership Steering Committee as one of the representatives for the Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage. So Ken had the website up here in a previous slide and for the partnership. And before I start talking about the planning tool, I did want to show you how to get to it on the website if ever you're out and about looking for it. So here's the partnership page down here, and the beautifully red circle that I added in there is focusing on the planning tool. So that's one of the things we've developed is the planning tool, and that's where you go. And then actually Adam and Brian will point you through how to use it here in the next stages. So while we talk about the planning tool today, it helps to understand why it was created. So Ken mentioned the summit that occurred in 2018, and objectives that emerged from the summit emphasized the need to have shared data, to communicate those data between agencies and to stakeholders in the public, and to develop a way to hone into areas of greatest need to address wildlife vehicle collisions and benefit wildlife movement and conservation. So that need for data sharing, working together, creating a shared pathway to identify important areas for wildlife accommodations, that is in part why the partnership formed that data and information work group that Ken also mentioned. And that working group has been really valuable to have data managers and GIS specialists closely interacting between the agencies and with Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage involvement within there. The data and information work group, it then indeed created the planning tool. And before I go further, I also want to note the term wildlife accommodations. So these are features or strategies that help promote wildlife connectivity and reduce wildlife vehicle collisions. They include wildlife crossing structures like overpasses, underpasses, culverts, associated wildlife fencing to funnel wildlife to those structures, jump outs or escape ramps, and they can include detection systems, signage, vegetation management, and the like. So the planning tool's purpose is to help identify areas of greatest need for wildlife accommodations across the state. It's a statewide resource to evaluate highway segments of interest for wildlife accommodations using data related to wildlife vehicle conflicts and wildlife movement and conservation along state-maintained highways specifically. Its intent is to help stakeholders work together to identify areas where people will subsequently focus more closely using additional data not available on the planning tool. The tool is not intended or designed to identify specific wildlife accommodation project locations. To do that, the partnership group or some combination of organizations and people and agency folks, they need to come together to collect or compile other finer scale data to undertake on the ground analyses, or they need to examine community interest surrounding land use and ownership, engineering feasibilities, and other considerations. And that finer scale information that is needed to identify specific project locations and determine the design and strategies at the site. And again, much of that is not available on the tool itself. So in addition to the overall purpose of identifying areas to consider wildlife accommodations, this tool can be used to anyone wanting a sense of wildlife issues along roadways across the state. So examples of related uses of this tool can include, for instance, land trusts. They can use it to look at a site where they might already be working with a willing private landowner that is wanting to add a conservation easement to their property. They can use this tool to help better understand conservation values and conflicts in that area. Similarly, land trusts might be able to look at these areas of greatest need that are highlighted in the tool and can examine within there whether they know or might connect with willing landowners in those areas to see if they'd be interested in adding conservation easements to their land. And this would be really valuable as lands on both sides of a highway should be protected with conservation easements or in public land ownership if wildlife accommodations are to be constructed. Another use could be that county planners could use it to better understand wildlife considerations along highways in their county, or public land managers or private landowners might recognize an area and they might think about how they could potentially help wildlife have less conflict in that area in some form or fashion. So the planning tool was built for a wide variety of folks, for stakeholders, for agencies, for interested public, for nonprofit organizations, for again, folks working in their own lines of work like land trusts and planners. Biologists from MDT and Fish, Wildlife and Parks, they have their own data and mapping systems that have more detailed information. So certainly they can use and will use this tool, but they also have their own systems that have fine scale data within them as well in various areas. So Ken mentioned briefly the partnerships project program. And again, we won't dive into that further here since there's the webinar on Thursday, but it is valuable to know how this planning tool relates to the project program. So as I've discussed already, the tool can be used to help point out an area that then a collaborative partnership may dive into further to examine using finer scale data where a possible project may be developed, and then they could submit that to the program in the future. Additionally, a project being proposed through the program, the project program, it needs to have data that support the purpose and need of the project. And the planning tool is one of the data sources that should be used when submitting an application. In fact, the evaluation criteria, one of them for selecting projects within the project program, includes the inclusion of planning tool data. So to learn again more about that project program, please go to the webinar on Thursday. And if you miss it, you can again watch its recorded version later. And you could also look at the partnership website already with lots of information under the project program to read all about it there. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Adam Messer so he can talk about how the planning tool was made. Adam?
Sounds good. Thanks, Kylie. Let me share my screen here. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Adam Messer. I'm the GIS coordinator at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and a member of the Data and Information Work Group. But today, I'm going to walk through and provide you guys an overview of the data and methodologies that we used to get to the layers that you're going to see represented in the planning tool. And Brian will show you that later. So the tool data development is outlined in a summary report accessible from the planning tool webpage. Kylie showed you a link for that earlier. And it's the link down here. And we want to recommend that you use this page for reference and to reference the report in the future, so that as we update that you'll have the most recent information available. So the summary report, it describes the data sets, the methodologies and decisions that the Data and Information Work Group made to generate the data layers shown in the plan. These layers, which identify the areas of greatest need for wildlife and transportation accommodation along Montana highways, are based on a broad range of transportation and wildlife information. We're not going to be talking about all of the details that went into the planning efforts or all of the data specifically, but what we want to do is cover broadly the process so you can have a basic understanding of the layers and data, how they were used to build the criteria, and hopefully be able to refer back to the report as needed if you have any future questions. Like I said, Brian's going to demonstrate the tool overall in a little bit here, but for familiarity, I'm going to walk through and show you some screenshots from the tool as we walk through the data process and the methodology. When you open the tool, a few slides down and much of the focus is going to be on this final analysis. We're going to start here today so we can talk about how this final layer was developed. And the Data and Information Work Group initially was tasked with compiling and evaluating the data to be used to identify the areas of greatest need for wildlife and transportation accommodations. So we started with a really broad array of data. For example, wildlife collision data, deer distribution, and grizzly bear dispersal, riparian corridors, among many others. And eventually, all of those data sets resulted in this final analysis with need values represented for each 1 mile segment of roadway in Montana that's managed by the Montana Department of Transportation. Note that these are Montana Department of Transportation maintained roads and highways. They're not local city or county maintained. So starting with this final product, we're going to step backwards and see how it was all brought together. Like I said, our initial work focused on a comprehensive exploration of information, which might help us identify areas with the greatest need for wildlife transportation accommodations. And the Data and Information Work Group considered data sources related to a range of wildlife values and transportation considerations. And from this broad evaluation, the group narrowed down the possible data sources and combined them into needs assessment criteria. And the needs assessment criteria are essentially thematic categories represented as map layers that are used for assessing the level of need for wildlife accommodations in the planning tool. And the final map is a compilation of these criteria, with each criteria contributing based on its assigned value that you see on the screen. And we're going to look at each of the criteria and what they represent before exploring how the criteria. So needs assessment criteria 1, and I apologize, I'll be reading from these slides just a little bit, then we'll go into a little bit more detail as we go through. So needs assessment criteria 1 is the risk to human safety and property damage resulting from wildlife vehicle conflict. This layer, this criteria focuses on the human element of risk to people and their property due to wildlife vehicle conflicts. This layer is comprised of 3 data sets representing measurements directly related to human safety on highways. And after looking at the other criteria, we're going to use this criteria 1 as our example of how each criteria layer was developed. And to step through the process, how crash, animal, carcass, and traffic volume were combined to be represented on this. Needs assessment criteria 2 is important daily and seasonal habitats for big game and carnivores. And this criteria focuses on the need for connectivity that supports the annual movement needs for big game and carnivore survival, reproduction, and dispersal. This layer is comprised of 15 data sets representing big game and carnivore distribution and connectivity. Needs assessment criteria 3 is important habitats for struggling or at-risk species. This criteria focuses on species considered at risk at either the state or federal level, and whose current distribution range includes Montana. This layer is comprised of 12 data sets, such as grizzly bear corridors, representing at-risk species, habitat, and connectivity. Needs assessment criteria 4, important habitats for a wide range of species. This criteria focuses on areas where wildlife accommodations could provide benefits to the highest number of species by connecting habitats that support a variety of species or provide intact habitat communities. This layer is comprised of 6 data sets, such as riparian corridors, and it represents areas of valuable habitat resources. Needs assessment criteria 5 is highway and adjacent linear infrastructure that may impede wildlife movement. This layer reflects the extent to which highways and adjacent linear features may impede wildlife movement now or in the future as traffic volumes are expected to increase. This layer is comprised of 5 data sets, such as nearby railways representing roadway characteristics important to wildlife transportation accommodation. So I'm going to flip through these slides a little bit so that we can see how the maps themselves change and how those criteria are different and are different. The needs assessment really highlights different areas of the state, depending on which of the criteria that you're looking at. So we're going to use needs assessment criteria 1 to evaluate now and back up one more step and look at how the different data inputs come together and contribute to the overall needs criteria. So the data set section of the summary report that I showed you when I first started talking covers the descriptions, limitations, and source for each data set. So for example, needs assessment criteria 1 is made up of three input data sets: the animal crash data, which is the total number of carcasses collected by the Montana Highway Patrol at the location of an incident; the Department of Transportation carcass data, which is the total number of carcasses collected on the road for state maintained roads, and the Department of Transportation's traffic volume data, which is the annual average daily traffic for the average 24-hour traffic volume at a given location along the route over the full 365 days of a year. Much like this criteria, each of the needs assessment criteria has a collection of contributing data sets. They were weighted based on an objective value of data quality and spatial accuracy. And then they were assigned a relative importance rating by the data and information workgroup members. So the data and information workgroup knew that each data set had characteristics which reflected the quality of the information. And we used the objective value of data quality and spatial accuracy to assign weights to each data set. You can see that spatial accuracy ranges from exact locations to representations that might cover a broad area. Data quality indicates the data accurately represents the data accurately represent the data set at a location, or it's a good index maybe of those data on the ground. In general, direct measurements at specific locations like crashes have higher values, and broad models such as riparian corridors would be coarser spatial resolution and less robust data quality. And by assigning the weights, we could increase the contribution of the stronger data sets to the criteria that they belong. When you look at Appendix 3 in the summary report, it's going to show you the table that's on the screen for each of the different criteria and its contributing data sets. So for this one, we can see the spatial accuracy and data quality measurements assigned for the 3 data sets contributing to needs assessment criteria 1. The other key piece of this is the overall needs assessment criteria % over on the far right, which was a ranking that represents the most important contributing data sets. This number was assigned using a ranking exercise conducted by each of the data and information workgroup members. And the weights and rankings were combined to get the mean criteria score and the % used to build the layers for each needs assessment criteria. So coming back to the map for needs assessment criteria 1, once we have those criteria values, they were applied to each 1 mile segment of roadway. So in this case, the crash, animal carcass, and traffic volume were calculated and then multiplied by their mean needs assessment criteria percentage. And then because the data within each criteria may not be on the same scale. For example, one criteria's raw values might range from 10 to 40, while another might be from 5 to 80. We normalize the data so that their lowest and highest values fit a 0 to 100 point scale. This allowed us to take each criteria value, such as those from criteria 1, and equitably compare them to the other needs assessment criteria. And we did this for each of the different needs assessment criteria to generate each of the layers. Lastly, the data and information workgroup used the same ranking exercise that I described earlier that we used within the criteria to get the % contribution of each criteria to calculate the final layer value. The rankings of subjective exercise where the data and information workgroup independently ranked the input data sets and criteria. And the rankings meant to be representative of public opinion. The data and information workgroup is a cross-section of the public, and the resulting weights have been consistent in repeated efforts. For example, ranking of the needs assessment criteria by the steering committee independently resulted in no significant changes to the needs assessment criteria weights when they were averaged with the data and information workgroup weights. So as we look at this final analysis map in the planning tool, hopefully you have a better understanding of how it reflects the 5 needs assessment criteria based on their percent contribution to that final score, and that each needs assessment criteria is based on a variety of data sets. They were evaluated on or within the proximity of each 1 mile segment of roadway. And the map values you see represent a suite of underlying wildlife and transportation information, which contributes to the overall score based on the strength of the data and its importance to the individual criteria to which it belongs. I do want to point out one other piece here. The final analysis map can be interpreted to generally reflect higher needs in the western part of Montana, with the northern plains and eastern Montana having relatively lower needs as we look at that now. And we do recognize that there's areas of need for wildlife transportation accommodation across the state, and understanding the level of need in one area may be best evaluated against those in the surrounding area, those needs in the surrounding area. So when you use the planning tool, you're going to see that the final values have been rescaled for each Montana Department of Transportation district, which allows for a more equitable evaluation of the areas of need within each district. We're going to take a second to address any questions that folks may have right now, and then we're going to pass it on to Brian Anderson, and he'll give you the tour of the planning tool itself.
Super, thanks Ken, Kylie, and Adam. Just a reminder to our participants, if you haven't yet done so or you joined late, please enter your name, affiliation, and email in the Q&A, and we'll keep those. And then if you have any questions for additional, questions for our first speakers, please also enter those into the Q&A as well. And so I did get a question here. Adam, this one is for you. What did you do if one of your input data sets was not available in a particular area? Do you know what that means? Okay.
I think so. So it really kind of depends on why the data set wasn't available. And so some of this is outlined in the summary report. In the case of grizzly bear connectivity or distribution, the data set, we considered it to be complete. It's considered a part of needs assessment criteria 3, important habitats for struggling or at-risk species. And grizzly bears occur in western Montana, and therefore the assessment of need relative to grizzly bears might be higher in that part of the state. However, it's considered value a layer of need for the western part of the state, and then that doesn't then occur in the eastern part of the state. However, the same scenario kind of plays out for things like white-tailed prairie dogs or black-footed ferrets. So not all species are distributed across the state, and it's kind of like stacking up a set of cards, and the things that contribute. The stack grows higher in the areas where there are more things in that area. So if the input data set was not available, but it was considered to not be available, then that was great. However, there are situations where we recognize that we had incomplete information. One of the most common examples of that is the big game distribution, where Fish, Wildlife, and Parks doesn't map big game distribution on reservations and national parks. Because the information's incomplete, but it should be considered to be in a particular area, we didn't dock those areas for not having the data. So I guess you could, just to make it a real simple example without getting into a lot of numbers, if we had the potential for 3 values, say riparian areas, grizzly bears, elk distribution, and they all might contribute 1 point to the assessment. In the national park, you only really had the potential to get 2 points. In the other parts, you had the potential to get 3 points. So we didn't dock the park areas for not having that level of distribution. And just to repeat, each data set is noted in Appendix 3 within the summary report as to whether or not it was complete for the state and whether or not we considered it statewide or whether or not we made that adjustment to not dock areas for areas of incomplete data.
Very good. Thank you.
Okay, Adam, Larry Sickerson is following up on that, and he wants to know more specifically, how were the lower traffic volumes and open space of eastern Montana weighted to balance against the megafauna of western Montana?
Sorry, Justin, can you repeat that one more time?
How were the lower traffic volumes and open space of eastern Montana weighted to balance against the megafauna of western Montana? Does that make sense?
Kind of.
I think you just answered it, but he's more specifically, he's asking eastern versus western Montana, which you could really see the dichotomy on the map.
Yeah, we didn't necessarily weight one of those inputs differently than the other. You know, if it existed in an area, it received its raw values, which were then weighted and ranked as we described. So we didn't make necessarily an accommodation for values that may have been higher or lower on the scale. So for example, just like I said, something might be present in an area, then we would consider it. Presence is binary, whereas traffic volumes are somewhat continuous from the slowest to highest value. And so when those continuous values tended to be low, they contributed less in an area where there's lower traffic volumes just by the nature of the data. And somebody from on the panel can ask if I didn't clarify that enough. Deb, if you're talking, you're muted.
Yeah, we can see you talking, but we can't hear you, Deb.
Sorry about that. Okay, we have another question. When it comes to the actual decision making, which map has the greater influence in determining priorities? Maybe Kylie, you could field that one.
It's a good question. You know, I think this will be one that will also make a lot more sense too once Brian goes and can walk us through the map proper. There's the layers here and the maps here are all fed into with the various data layers that Adam was mentioning here. But again, there needs to be consideration of all the other pieces that aren't on the planning tool as well that I had mentioned in the section I had talked about the need to include more regionally and locally specific things that are not quite mappable. For instance, local support, funding opportunities, on the ground feasibilities, all of those components that are just not within this mapping tool. Those will also weigh in so heavily into the priorities in terms of the project program. And that might be the question where the question is directed is in terms of determining priorities for the project program process. And in fact, in addition, it's whenever you're looking at this tool, it basically depends on why you're looking at it. You might be wanting to dive in for any number of reasons. And so that will really depend on your purpose and what you're trying to look for. Are you just looking at where are the rare species and where they overlap with the highway system, or are you looking at this, that, or the other thing? So I would argue none of these is like a one and done map to look at solely. It's really interesting to look at how they all interact and how they shift depending on which which of the maps or the criteria you're looking at. So I guess there's no real final answer to that question.
Okay, here's another one for Adam, I think. Adam, was data for big game broken into migratory routes and winter ranges?
No, the information for big game distribution was simply presence, absence in this example. There were certain species that had migratory information available, such as pronghorn, and those were included. But as for designating specific use types other than that, that wasn't done for big game.
Okay, so maybe we have time for one or two more. Question, would it be possible for GIS staff to add the criteria GIS service layers that power the planning tool into agency-specific planning tools?
I think that's going to be a question for Brian. I
Yeah.
believe so.
Right, or the steering committee potentially.
Yeah, this is Brian. I can answer that. The services are available. They're public and available either through the app, or if you refer to our the actual documentation on the website and pull up the information there, the URLs are spelled out in that document that Adam was talking about, so they are available. And I would say they're all available as services if they were available. Some of the sources we had to download and host ourselves through coordination with the data providers. So they're not all REST services necessarily.
And just to expand on that, if a data set is available, it will be outlined in the list of data sets within the summary report with the URLs provided in that document.
And I think just as a quick follow on to what Kylie was saying, this planning tool is at a planning level. It's information at a course scale to help focus collaborations and partnerships around solving problems in a collaborative way, to be leveraging resources and information to work together to identify these projects. It's not at a scale and is not intended to be used as a priority tool. These aren't priorities. These are areas of need across our state based on these 5 criteria. Is that fair, Kylie? Okay, excellent. Okay, well, that looks like we've wrapped up questions for that. If we want to go into Brian's presentation, thank you, Ken, Kylie, and Adam.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Anderson. Do I have my camera on? No. Hello, world. Okay, Brian Anderson, MDT. I'm the Geospatial Information Supervisor here, and I'm also a member of the Data and Information Work Group that helped build this tool, and I'm going to guide you through the tool. I don't know whether I volunteered or I made a mistake or I was voluntold, but I'm doing a live demonstration, so wish me luck. And then let's see here. So I'm going to start from the very beginning. Before I do that, MDT kind of has a reputation of doing dad jokes before presentations, thanks to our director. And I had actually a great dad joke I was going to tell, and I was worried about it. It was one about chemistry, and I was just really worried I wasn't going to get a reaction. So I'm not going to tell it. So I'm going to move on. Can't hear anybody laughing. So we're going to go to our website here at mdt.mt.gov. And on that site, under public involvement, if you click on the overview and go to getting involved down here, and then Montana Wildlife Transportation Partnership, and you've seen this on a few previous slides, but that is how you access it. And at the top here, there's a lot more information on this site that you guys can go through if you would like. We're obviously focusing on the planning tool today, so I'm going to click on that one. And we have write-ups about a few areas, what it's about, the planning tool description, which has already been covered, the planning tool summary report, which was covered by Adam, a help guide of how to use the tool, which I am going to go in depth into, and then explore the planning tool, which is actually a live link to the tool itself. So I think one of the best ways to walk through this tool, I wouldn't say it's overly complex, it's fairly intuitive, but it can get complex. So I think we did a pretty good job writing a help guide to provide you a step-by-step of how to use that tool, and then refer back to that if you need additional support and help. So I'm going to click on the help guide here, and it is a PDF that will walk you through some of this information. We have a table of contents that is live linked. So if you know a particular area of the tool that you're struggling with or want more information about, you are able to zoom right to that area in the table of contents here. So that is a live link there. Quick overview of what the tool is about. I think we've covered that in previous slides. A couple frequently asked questions. This tool is definitely intended for desktop computer, laptop computer use, mobile platforms. It isn't great. It's okay, but certainly we're getting into a lot of data. So the intent is to be viewed on a computer. Let's see. I think I'm going to go through most of these already for you. So we will move on and jump to the final analysis map. We'll zoom in here a little more. So the final analysis map is basically kind of the meat and potatoes of everything that Adam was talking about. There is more to this tool, and we'll go through that as well. But first, I kind of want to do just a quick overview of all the tools and things you can do in the final analysis map. And I am going to open this up live, and we'll walk through this as well. So I'm going to be fairly brief here, and then we're going to get into a little bit more detail as we open up the links. So there's your standard navigation tools, your zoom in, zoom outs. Default extent is zooming back to the state of Montana and finding your location. If that works on your computer, that's obviously going to be your IP address, so it might not be perfectly accurate. We have some analysis tools that we've added, which I think are pretty cool. We have a swipe tool. Again, I'm going to be demoing that for you, where you can compare two different NACs or different layers. We have a selection tool where you're able to select certain segments of our data and either isolate those to get more information in the table, or even export that information for your use. We have a filter tool where you're able to filter based on score, so you can only see scores based on certain ranges. And then we have a tool to actually add your own data. So you can add your own services, you can add shapefiles, you can add XY tabular data from a CSV or something. And then up here in the map options, we have some fairly standard things. If you're used to looking at web applications like this or map applications, we have a legend, a layer list, which lists everything that's currently visible on the map. And then we have the open map and new tab. I'll show you that. That just pops it up into a new tab browser. And then base maps. So if you want to look at an aerial photograph behind this map, you have that option as well. And then the attribute table, I'll go over that as well. So as you can see, we get pretty detailed in each one of these options as they're numbered here, 1 through 4. And this goes into depth on exactly what the swipe tool does, all those tools inside of the analysis tools, as well as map options. So we go into pretty deep detail about how you can turn things on and off, what you can do with them, and what everything needs. So really good reference. If you want to start here and work your way through it, that's a great way to do it. Or you can actually refer back to this as needed. Kind of cruise through this. There's your base map gallery. I will show that. The attribute table, I will also show that. You can start seeing something that looks like an Excel table there. And then the individual criteria maps. So each one of these, Adam was showing you a few slides of that. That is in the app itself, and descriptions of each one of those. And that's fully interactive as well. And then the district maps, one other area in the story map that'll break out and symbolize based on district. And then some contact information to our team here that help put that tool together. So I will jump back here. And I will go down to the Explore the Planning tool. That again is the direct link to the tool here. We'll open that up. And one of the first things I do like to do when using really any web map or something that's pulling a lot of data off the web is I do clear my cache. This is also kind of the, if you used to get told by IT to restart your computer if you're having problems, if you're in a web app, clear your cache as one of the first things you do, and that usually fixes most of your problems. So I'm going to go ahead and do that there. And I will start guiding you through this. So this is kind of a scroll through story map. If you're not familiar with those, it's just really, we're trying to tell a story about the data and maps that we've put together. So some information about the description of the tool itself, an overview, which I believe has been fairly well gone over so far. A help guide. So again, a link. So now we're in the app itself. We're not on our own page. We have another link back to that help guide. So if you ever need to go back to that, it's always at the top here. And that is interactive at the top. So you can always get back to our help guide, which so opens up that PDF. Contact information if you need some help, technical help from me or my team. Some information, legal stuff from MDT, terms of use and accessibility if you need some help there. Then we have got to have a pie chart, right? So we have our needs assessment criteria and the breakouts and the percentages of those that went into our final scoring for your viewing pleasure. Then we got the final analysis map. So that does load right into this story map as we're scrolling down, and it's fully interactive inside of this story map. I'm actually going to cruise past this and come back to it because that's probably the more complicated part of this tool. So we'll go to the individual criteria map. Again, you can tab back and forth at the top here. So we are on the 5th option here, individual criteria maps, and we get right into the first one. So risk to human safety, property damage resulting from wildlife vehicle conflict. So Adam went into pretty good detail on that one, but here is that description again, and we have a fully live map. So we're able to start looking at segments of just that NAC. So this is not the file analysis data. This is just the data that was compiled for NAC and the score of that. And then we have a location. So we say reference points, which is the mileposts out on the road. And this one would be at 36 plus 0.842 after that reference post to 37.849 on Montana 81. And then the score is 25 out of 100. So, and you actually even get the information of all the other NACs here, but we're highlighting the obviously the NAC for this one here. So not a ton of functionality here. You can do some searches. You have a legend you can turn on and off. You can go back to the whole state, zoom in and out. You can pop that out as well. And as expected, as we scroll down, the next NAC2 comes up and what it is, and now we get new information. The color changes, criteria changes, and the score changes. Number 3, number 4, a prize for whoever guessed what the next one is. Oh, number 5. And we can see we still have a fully functional map, but that data has changed. And as we scroll down, now we're getting into our next tab here. So MDT district maps, as Adam talked about at the end of his presentation, we have not rescored these, but we have resymbolized these to show them based on their scores just in a district. So as you're interested in certain regions, you can see how those scores are looking compared to the rest of them within that district themselves. So this is Missoula District, again, pretty much the same functionality, legend. Jump down. I got the legend here if you want to turn that on or off. It's a fully interactive map. You can get our data here. And if you want to go to the next district, this one's kind of a scrolling sideways instead of scrolling down. So as we go through our districts here, you can see each one. You can see a lot more color in each one of those districts compared to the final one, based on just that area itself. And then Billings District is our last district, and you can start that process over or go back. Then continuing to scroll down, we have a summary. So Adam started talking about the summary report. This is a link to that. We can click on that, and it's going to pull up the entire summary report for you. So again, we have a table of contents. If you're interested in something, I'm actually going to come back to this and show you a live example of how we can use that while we're exploring some data, but it is all there and it's accessible from this tool. A little thank you for enjoying the tool, and some contacts from our team. So this will take you back to our website, the MDT website, Fish, Wildlife and Parks, Montanans for Safe Wildlife Passage, and some information about accessibility. So with that, I am going to jump back up to the final analysis map. And this certainly is a fully functional map within the story map itself. I would suggest if you need quick information, scores, or you're just kind of zooming in, zooming out, getting quick things, I think this is a fine environment to do that. However, if you want to start getting into some of the analysis tools and switching base maps and playing around with the data and things like that, my suggestion and the suggestion in the help guide is to use this open live content in new tab option, which is what I am going to do. So as you can see, that actually pops that up into a new tab. So we are outside of the story map at this point, but we are inside of this map, which just kind of gives us a little bit better viewing experience for that information. And now I will walk you through each one of these tools. Plus goes in, minus goes out, home. We're going to go back to where we started at the great state of Montana. The My Location is going to give you zoom into your IP location, wherever that is. We have a address or place. So if we go to Montana, did I spell Townsend right? Maybe not, just didn't capitalize it. Go to Townsend, Montana, we're going to scroll right into Townsend, Montana. So that is a fully functioning, fairly similar to Google if you're used to that. And that will zoom you around there. And then we can always get back to the information there if we want, or back to the state of Montana here too. We have a swipe tool. So in order to use this swipe tool, we need 2 layers on. So right now, if we look at our legend, we have our final needs assessment criteria score and some boundary information. That's all we have on right now. So if I'm swiping, I'm only seeing one thing, right? The base map and our final needs assessment criteria. So if you want to see how that final needs assessment criteria scored up based on, let's say, NAC 1, now on our right side, so think of it as this one is on the left side always, whichever swipe layer I have included is going to be on the left, and whatever layer below that, which is indicated on the layer list, is on the right. You can actually start looking at each one of these in different areas, and as you ID these, that's the final score. And if we swipe over there, we're going to get NAC 1 now. So you can kind of use it to compare information, or even information. I'm going to go a little more in depth about all these layers, but you can look at, public lands, conservation easements, parcels, traffic, if you need to know the traffic in a certain area. So pretty powerful tool built in there for information gathering. The select tool allows us to select certain segments for more data gathering, more information, and also allows us to export that information. So how we use that tool is we have a selection. It even gives you a little indication, press down and start, let go, finish. So we're going to select these segments that we're interested in. And now there's a few ways, as with most GIS tools, you can do this a few different ways. One of the best ways is to stay in this tool, select, and click your 3 little dots here. Now you have the option to zoom to those, pan, flash is going to flash it on the screen. And then we get into some pretty cool things. You can export that to a CSV file that's going to come up as a table. I will show you that. Export to a feature collection, a GeoJSON file. I always get made fun of this one. If you're a GIS person, you probably know what that is, or a programmer, IT person. If not, you can skip it or Google it. Statistics about that, about those selection or those particular segments that we have selected there. Create a layer. So that's going to be an option if you have ArcGIS Online account and you're able to create data yourself to host in your own environment. Same with my content. But we are actually going to view that in the attribute table. So this should look familiar to most people. It looks pretty much like an Excel file. This is all the data behind that. So not only do we have all the needs assessment criteria and the final score, NAC1, NAC2, NAC3, we start getting some information about that road as well. So route MDT route ID, the segment begins and ends, reference point. We have what we call our departmental route, that sign route, which is what would be familiar in the real world to users. Some functional class information, whether it's state maintained. In this case, all these routes are state maintained. Service type, width. So quite a bit of information about that road is also in this file. So if you are really concentrating on a segment, you can get quite a bit of information there. Even here, you can go in and we can export that to a CSV. So it's still the same ones we've selected, or we can select 1 or 2 or all of them. And we can actually export that to a CSV. And now I have it in a very familiar environment for most people. And you can take the data and put it into a report or forward it on to someone else about that, those particular ones that we have selected from that map. Okay. Down and up arrow, I will always open and close that attribute table. So that's how we do that. We'll clear our selection and move on to the next tool. Filter. So filter, fairly self-explanatory, but the needs assessment criteria score is between. So we can do 50 and 70. I don't know where that would really make sense, but we can do it. And now we can see in this area that we certainly have some segments that fall outside of that filter. So that may be handy. Another powerful tool that we added in here is adding your own data. So if you have your own local data or you know a certain area that you are interested in, you can either add that as a URL. So if you've created the service of this, we're starting to get in some a little more advanced GIS functionality, but the options are there for people. So you can add web services, KML files. So if you get something from someone in the field, CSV files, so that would be XY locations, which is fairly easy to build yourself, or a file. So here's all the file types you can add. So again, a little more GIS-y, but shape files, KMLs, GPX, GeoJSON files. And you can browse for that and add them right from your own computer. Or you can search the ArcGIS Online library, which has millions, literally millions of data out there for people to access free. And if we want to know terrain slope, we can add that information. Oh, and of course, this is one we got to log in for, so maybe we can't add that one. See, live demo. Careful. So now that I'm logged in, I could add that particular one or the ones that are in my organization. But so some of these requires you to be logged in. Some of them don't. Unfortunately, I don't know if there's a great way to tell, but you'll know as soon as you hit that add button, as I just found out. Yeah, if we want to zoom back into Townsend area and add some slope. See what that looks like. A little scary. I haven't added this one. Boom. Slope data. So that's pretty cool. So that might give you some information. I'm not a biologist. I don't know much about the animal movements, but I'm sure that could probably give you some more information about that. So yeah, pretty handy tool there to be able to add your own data on a map that we provided for you. So moving on to the tools in the upper right, we have our legend. So as we turn things on and off, that legend will change. So drawing right into our layer list, if I would like to view railroads, I can turn those on. You see those pop up right there. I go back to my legend and we can see that those railroads are now turned on. Same with parcels. We zoom in. This is cadastral, a few different names for this. Most people have seen this by now, but it's property information. So we can get live, well, not live, most up-to-date data available for cadastral and parcel information. So this, all that information is available right here. Sign routes. So now we've added some shields and information about that road, bridges. These are ones from MDT's inventory. If we got one close here, where are we at? It's North of Townsend, right? There we go. There's a bridge, an IV that. So in this case, I had to enable that pop-up. Some of these are on, some of them are off for ease of use. If you turn everything on, you're going to have a big mess and you're going to have to scroll through things. So some of that functionality is dependent to the user. So in this case, I had to turn that pop-up on by clicking on the little 3 dots here and enabling the pop-up there. And now I can get information, bridge ID number, and a whole ton of information about that bridge. Structure addresses. So this is from the state library. So you can see based on, you can see some of these squares here that are houses and structure information about that and whatever information that the state library has on that particular structure. Administrative boundaries, a lot of different boundaries in here. I'm not going to go through them all. Cities and towns, reservations, congressional districts. This is from state library as well. We have hydrology. So as you can see, now we're starting to get into a lot of rivers and streams and waterways. So all of that information is available. Conservation easements. So as we click on that, we can get information about a conservation easement, who's the holder of that, acreage, deed reference, date it was entered, and a unique ID if you need to reference back to that. Public lands, and now we're getting into types of lands around these roads and our segments. And again, the legend is here and it'll tell you what those colors are. Or alternatively, you can click on that. And as I'm clicking on these, so you can see these little arrows. Some of them have multiple layers below those. So if you looked at, what was a good one? Administrative boundaries. So there's a whole bunch below that. So if I click on one of them, it's just going to be, it looks like reservations and county is turned on right now, but you would have to actually click this down arrow and turn on the ones that you would like. So I usually click that down arrow first to see what I'm dealing with. And then if I know it's only one, then you can go to that and you can see the conservation easements. PLSS information. All here, quarter section. And land cover, finally. So information about the land cover. Turn these off, go back up, turn my needs assessment criteria back on. Close that out, and then I want to be able to view the aerial imagery. I will turn that on. And imagery is an option. So now we can zoom in, we can start seeing some buildings and some agricultural areas. You can see the railroad here now. And there's quite a few here. So hybrid is going to add some cartography and road names and things like that in there. And this is brought to you by Esri. OpenStreetMap, just another view. Terrain is one of Esri's labels, or one of their layers that they provide. Topographic is what we usually use for our base maps, but in this case, that dark gray canvas works pretty good to highlight the routes. Even the USA topo maps. So there's the old topo maps as well. And some of these are scale dependent. So it looks like this one might be, as we zoom in, you can see that actually goes away. There's no use zooming in past this scale because it's just going to get rasterized. So if you see things turn on and off, it's usually nothing is working incorrectly. It's working as designed. It's just scale dependent, whether you zoom in or out. Speaking of that, as we zoom out here, you can see some of these get gray. So you can see parcels is gray right now. Switch my base map to dark gray canvas, go back to the layer list and go to Montana parcels. So if I was to turn this on, nothing's going to happen. I think the last thing anybody would want is for all the parcels to show up and potentially crash their computer because there's going to be thousands of them, right? So this is your indication that you need to zoom in to view that. So as I zoom in now, I'm at a scale where we thought it was appropriate to start showing parcel information. And you could see the other ones kind of popped up too. So sign routes and structures also have been popping in and out. So as we zoom out even more, now our off-system routes, which are more local roads, turn off because you don't want those at a state scale as well. Okay. So cover the base map, and then the last button on the top right is an about section. So we actually added the help guide to this. So you can click right here. That's going to open up your help guide. So if you need help with one of these tools, more explanation about them, you can go right to it here rather than going back to the app itself. And then this link will send you back to the logo link will send you back to our page. And let me see if I missed anything else here. I think that is about it. So if you remember, that was a lot of information. I went through it pretty in detail, but again, we have a great help guide that will walk you through that as you have questions. And if you don't remember anything, write down our URL here and how to get to that tool, because I think our team did a great job at putting everything together and very accessible for people to get the information they need. So with that, I think we will jump to more Q&A.
There's one question here that I think is definitely for you, Brian. Can we search by a lat long, or do you just eyeball and zoom to a location that you're interested in?
Better unmute myself here. So I believe thought there was a way to do that. It might be I have to get back to you, but I thought you could do it here, or you can type that in here. I think you can actually type it in here. I had a great lat long. Let's grab this. Live demo. Yep. So you can type it right into the search bar, it looks like.
Okay, another question, Brian, is about the exporting of data from a couple segments of road. Can you demonstrate that tool?
Yep. I think I did do that, but I can go over it again. So it's actually a selection. So there's no tool that just says export data. You need to select that information first. So if we're interested in this area here, we're actually going to select using the select tool, press down, start, and let go to finish. And then now we see that there's 3 selected here. And you can save that as a CSV file, which is, I guess, the only demonstration I did do. You can export that to other things. If you have an ArcGIS Online account, you can create a layer from that. And then I'll actually pop it into your ArcGIS Online account. Or actually, it might even pop it here. Yep. So actually what that did is it popped it into your layer list here as a test. And then that lives inside the map. So it looks like that is an option to add things here. So that just added those 3, I believe. Yep. So if I turn that off, that added that 3. GeoJSON file, saved my content, so I can save that if I have an ArcGIS Online account, and I'll go right into my data.
Okay, I got a question here that's maybe for you, Brian, or maybe for Adam. How do you plan to update the planning tool when new data layers or updated information is available?
So we have talked about that. We thought we were hoping that we could. I don't know if we settled on a specific date, but this is a repeatable process. It's actually quite complex with a lot of data elements, over 50, I think. But the way that this was modeled and put together, we intentionally paid attention to making this repeatable. Now, that's not to say, you know, we should be doing this monthly or anything like that, but I think we wanted to try to commit to annually getting this updated. But that might not be the correct answer. But I'll speak from my end of things. On the GIS end of things, we're certainly able to run our processes and get this up to date. I wouldn't say as requested, but as appropriate in a fairly short amount of time, just because of all the work that we put in to make this a repeatable process. So maybe Deb can help with the timeline on when they were expecting to actually update these.
And well, it's in the summary report. So didn't know if Adam had that up, in which case he could refer to it, but it is available through the summary report. It's called the MWTP PT maintenance plan right there. There you go. And so in that text, it will describe. And so it's about, I mean, it being a live tool, and there will be just general maintenance and updating, you know, the data sets in there, but to add new information was either going to be on a as determined basis under approval of the steering committee if it's deemed to be like super critical to, you know, analysis or a criteria. But other than that, it's going to be at the 5-year interval. Maintenance, I believe, occurs either annually, if that's what you said, updated annually, correct, with current versions of the data sets that are included. And then it would be at 5-year intervals for new information or as deemed appropriate by the steering committee. And that's literally just because of the amount of work it takes to kind of rerun everything at that point. So, yeah. So that all this information, and this is a really great segue into everything. So all the information you could possibly want is in the summary report and also in those other narratives that Brian showed earlier, all available through our website, through the planning tool, the description, the summary report, the help guide, and then actually access to the tool itself. So we encourage everyone to use the resources that are provided through the website as your first go-to, and then you can always use the contact us if you can't find what you're looking for or you need some additional help. You would submit your questions through that contact us link through the website as well.
And that brings up something that I think I missed. So I'm going to ask myself a question. How do you add more URLs? So actually, I think Andrew asked this question about accessing the data that we use to create, used in the analysis to put together these NACs. So those are actually all listed here in our data sets. And the metadata, so that the data owners and sources and services are available inside of the summary report. So if you wanted to grab one of these data layers, you can do that. So if you wanted to add the Northern Rockies Black Bear connectivity service, you can actually grab the link right from here. So all I did was right click and copy that link. And then I can go back to my tool and I can do an add data and a URL. I can paste that in. I can add that. And now, unfortunately, they didn't publish it with an amazing name, but it is going to show up as we zoom here. And now we have that Black Bear connectivity. So thanks for your question, Brian.
Well done. So I'm not currently seeing any more questions in the Q&A. If you joined us late and have not yet done so, please enter your name, affiliation, and email in the Q&A. And just remember that this presentation is being recorded and will be posted on the website, as will our project program webinar, which will be held on Thursday, will also be recorded and posted on our website so that you all can continue to reference back to them as you see fit for assistance in the future. So I guess we'll give a last call for any questions or other information that you desire at this time. Otherwise, we get to let you out a little bit early. Okay, I see people are entering their name and email, so appreciate that. Yeah, and very well done, everyone. We'll keep it open here so people can continue to add their information. Seems like that's still occurring. And other than that, we look forward to seeing all of you on Thursday for the project program webinar as well. Thank you so much for joining us and for your participation today in the Montana Wildlife and Transportation Partnership Planning Tool webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Casey, I think it's safe to stop record.